Chapter 26. The Harp Arrives. Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the black recipe book, which had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before her. She'd got the book down, but she wanted to check the quantities of sugar that were needed for making some apricot preserve she was making. She'd found the amounts almost at once, but now, some 10 minutes later, she was still sitting with the book in front of her and the page open with the entry Annika had copied in on Christmas Eve. "A pinch of nutmeg will improve the flavour of the sauce," she read, for perhaps the 100th time since Annika had gone. Easter was over. On the Thursday before the holiday weekend, the Emperor had given out purses for the poor and washed the feet of 12 needy gentlemen who had been brought to him from almshouses in the city. Some of the needy gentlemen had enjoyed having their feet washed by the Emperor, and some had not, but that was neither here nor there, because the feet washing was a tradition and had to be carried on. After that, on Good Friday, the paintings and crucifixes in the churches had been shrouded in purple, and the sounds of the street became muffled while the citizens mourned the death of Christ. And then, on Easter Sunday, the bells had pealed out joyously. There was music everywhere, the sun shone, and everyone in Vienna seemed to have a new hat. Ellie had done her best with Easter. She had not bought a new hat, because her brown felt hat was only 10 years old and had plenty of life in it still. But she had done all the things she had done the year before, and the year before that. She had hard-boiled eggs for the little Bodek boys to paint. She had baked Easter muffins for Pauline and her grandfather, and a simnel cake for the professors, and she and Sigrid had taken flowers to the church. But nothing gave her any joy. "I have to get over it," Ellie told herself. "It's over 2 months since she went. Why doesn't it get better?" But it didn't get better. If anything, missing Annika got worse. There was a knock at the back door, and Pauline came in, carrying her scrapbook and a pot of glue. Since Annika had gone, she had come quite often to work in Ellie's kitchen. "Have you had a letter?" she asked. "No. Have you?" "No, and Stefan hasn't either." "It's not so long since you wrote?" "It's longer than it's ever been," said Pauline. "Perhaps her mother had sent her into the forest with a huntsman and told her to kill him and bring back her tongue, like in the stories." "For goodness sake, Pauline, what is the matter with you? What have you got against Frau Eltraut?" "She's an aristocrat. They're always doing things like that. Look at Count Dracula. And that horrible perfume she wears, like mangled wolves." But Sigrid came in at the moment and told Pauline to stop upsetting Ellie. Hating people helps some people, but it only gave Ellie a stomachache. Pauline put down her scrapbook and the pot of glue and reached for the scissors. She'd found a story she liked very much, about a little boy who had climbed into a hot air balloon, been carried away, but a crippled lady had raced after it in her wheelchair and managed to get hold of the rope and hold on. For a while there was peace, as Sigrid started on the ironing and Ellie went back to the stove. Then Professor Gertrude's bell sounded from her bedroom. It was not her usual gentle ring, but louder and more insistent. "Something's the matter," said Sigrid. They trooped out into the hall and found Professor Gertrude still in her dressing gown and slippers. "It's come," she said agitatedly. "I saw from the window. It's come." No one asked what had come. There was only one thing that could make Professor Gertrude run round the hallway in like a headless chicken, with her grey plait hanging down her back. Her new harp. The great concert grand harp, ordered from Ernst and Kohlhardt months ago. The largest and most valuable instrument of its kind in the city. A ring on the front door was followed by a volley of thumps. Sigrid opened it to reveal an elegant delivery van with the words "Instrument makers to the Imperial Court" scrolled on the side, and the two men wheeling an enormous wooden case towards them. It was painted a shining black, and the heavy clasps that fastened it were gold. It might have been the coffin of an exotic giraffe. "We'll have to leave it at the door," they said. "We've got to take the trolley back." And, with much muttering and heaving, they set their load down on the pavement, presented Professor Gertrude with a receipt to sign, and pocketed their tip. Professor Julian and Professor Emile were both out, but Gertrude knew exactly what to do. "Fetch Stefan," she ordered, and Pauline ran off across the square. Stefan was always fetched when something heavy had to be dealt with. He was by far the strongest of the Bodeck boys, and he came at once. Behind him, although he had told them to stay home, ran two of his younger brothers, Hansi and George. Sigrid had already moved the whole table, and the umbrella stand. Ellie took away the potted palm. "You take the back end," Professor Gertrude ordered Stefan, "and I'll take the front." "Let me," began Sigrid. Professor Gertrude waved her away. Even for Stefan, the weight was enormous, but he managed to lift the case, and Professor Gertrude, walking backwards, made her way upstairs. On the third stair, her bedroom slipper came off. On the sixth, she became entangled with her dressing gown cord, but she carried on, stepping bravely backwards with her bare foot. At the landing, they stopped. Gertrude's door was wedged open, but would the case go through? "I think it would be better to unpack it here," said Stefan, lowering the case. On these matters, Stefan always listened to Professor Gertrude. This time, Professor Gertrude took the keys hanging from one of the clasps, and slowly, solemnly, she unlocked the case. The inside, padded with gold and burgundy brocade, was unbelievably sumptuous. The harp itself was wrapped in a shawl of ivory silk, a present from the makers to those who bought this precious instrument. Stefan lifted it out and carried it into Professor Gertrude's room. Then he came out again. The door was shut, and everyone went back downstairs, knowing that this was a time when Gertrude needed to be alone. In the kitchen, Ellie had started to brew coffee and reached for the tin of biscuits, which she kept for the little Bodeck boys. But when she turned round, there was no sign of them. Stefan was there, and Pauline, but not George, and not Hansi. This was strange, as Hansi suffered terribly from hunger, and usually stationed himself by Ellie's biscuit tin as soon as he arrived. "They must have gone home," said Stefan. "I'll go and see." He came back, looking puzzled. "They're not there." They searched the downstairs rooms, the yard, but before they had time to go anxious, a kind of scrabbling sound came from the upstairs landing. The harp case was where they had left it, flat on the ground. Sigrid lifted the lid. Inside, the two little boys lay together, curled like puppies. "It's our house," said George blissfully. "It's the best house in the whole world. We're going to live in it forever and ever." The following day was a Sunday, and Pauline and Stefan set off early to tidy up the hut. Even though they couldn't do plays without Annika, they still liked to use it for picnics and meetings with carefully chosen friends. There were signs that the deserted garden was not going to be theirs for much longer. Barbed wire over the gate to the drive had been removed, perhaps to let the lorries through when the workmen came. Yet, on this fine spring morning, it was still very quiet and very beautiful. There was dew on the grass. A thrush sang in a branch on the cedar. They walked past the pond, past the ruined steps. Then Pauline stopped dead. "There's something behind the house. A wild animal. I can hear it, snorting. I'm going home." Before she could turn and run, the wild animal appeared. His rich coat was lit up by a shaft of sunlight. His black mane and tail rippled like silk. Because he was hobbled, he could only walk at a measured pace. But he came on steadily, his ears twitching with curiosity and interest. "I only like horses when they're in books," said Pauline, and backed away. But Stephen was now staring at the door of the hut. "I think the padlock's been—" He broke off. "My God, look!" He pushed open the door. On the floor, wrapped in the old grey blanket, and fast asleep, lay a completely unknown boy. 3 hours later, the compound behind the professor's house, which Ellie and Sigrid kept so tidy, looked like a junkyard. An old wardrobe, a washstand, a mangle, and several portraits of the professor's grandparents in oils were stacked beside the wall. And on the blue bench, where the servants liked to sit, the little Bodeck boys, their eyes on the door of the shed, which had been turned back into a stable. The lady in the paper shop was there too, ready with advice, because she had grown up on a farm. And looking placidly over the half door was Rocco, chewing on a carrot. But Zed was in Annika's bed in the attic, lost to the world. "He's come from Annika," Pauline had said excitedly, running into Ellie's kitchen. "He's got something to tell us. He's ridden all the way from Spittal." Ellie had gone out and looked carefully at the boy standing in the yard, holding on to his horse. He was grey with exhaustion and so thin that his cheekbones seemed to cut into the skin. "Is Annika hurt?" she said. "No." "Or ill?" Zed shook his head. "Well, then you'll let Stefan look after the horse. His uncle's a blacksmith. He knows what to do. As for you, you'll go straight in the bath while I get you some breakfast. Drop your clothes on the floor. Frau Bodeck will find you something to wear. Her eldest is about your size. Then, into bed." "But I have to—" "You don't have to do anything," said Ellie, "except do as you're told." So now Zed slept, and the household waited. It was late afternoon before he woke. Clean clothes lay on the chair beside his bed. He got up and looked out of the window at the view Annika had described to him, and suddenly he was glad he had come to Vienna. They would not believe him when he told his story. No one would believe him. But he was glad that he had come. First, though, he had to see to his horse. He hurried down and into the yard. As soon as Rocco saw him, he went into his "Where have you been?" routine, whinnying and butting Zed with his head, stamping his hooves. But the show he put on as a deserted horse was not convincing. A piece of apple hung out of his mouth. Stefan's uncle had brought straw for bedding. There were oats in his manger. And on the blue bench sat the Bodeck boys, holding the fresh supply of carrots they had begged from Ellie in case he was overcome by hunger. And now everyone was gathered round the kitchen table, waiting to hear Zed's story. Ellie and Sigrid, Stefan and Pauline, and the professors, who suggested that they come downstairs, knowing how much Ellie hated the drawing room. "I don't know if you'll believe me," Zed began. "Probably not. What I'm telling you is the truth. When Annika came to Spittal, everything was run down. The farm and the house, everything. There were holes in the roof, the servants had been laid off, the food was awful. The first day I met Annika, she was eating mangelwurzels. Ellie made a shocked noise. But Zed went on. Annika thought that perhaps this was the way the aristocracy lived, toughening themselves up, not lighting fires and eating turnip jam. Another exclamation of horror came from Ellie. "You can't make proper jam from turnips," she said. Professor Julius gave her a stern look, and she fell silent. "I knew what was the matter," Zeb went on. Frau Eldrat's husband was a gambler, and there was absolutely no money left. But nobody explained this to Annika, and it wasn't for me to tell her. Her mother didn't want Annika to get mixed up with the servants. But Annika likes to be busy, and she came down to the farm to help me, and we became friends. And then Frau Eldrat and her brother-in-law and her sister went off to Switzerland. They went on urgent business, they said. And when they came back, everything was different. "In what way?" said Professor Emil. "Well, they were all wearing new clothes, and they seemed to be in a very good mood, and they'd brought presents. Expensive presents, except for Annika's. She got galoshes that were too small for her," said Zed, scowling for a moment as he remembered this. "And then they started engaging servants, and mending the roof, and Herman, Annika's brother, was got ready to go to a cadet school where the fees cost a fortune. And Frau Eldrat told Annika that her godfather, who lived in Switzerland, had died and left her all his money. A lot of money. He said he was called Herr von Grontius, and they'd gone to Zurich to give him a proper funeral. I'd never heard of anyone speak of him. I didn't think about it too much till the Eckhart girl came and attacked Annika and accused her of stealing her great-aunt's trunk." "Lommery attacked Annika?" No one had heard this. The Eggharts were still away. "Where was that?" "At Bad Hexenfeld. She didn't attack her exactly, but she accused her in a coffee shop, and Annika was very upset. She didn't know anything about it. And Annika's mother said that no one in Spittal knew anything about a trunk. She defended Annika, and the Eggharts slunk off. But then—" Zed had fallen silent, wondering again if anyone would believe the next part of the story. Why should they believe a boy they knew nothing about? "Has Annika said anything about a dog? About Hector?" he went on. Pauline nodded. "He had an accident when he was a puppy, and he has a leg missing. She likes him a lot." "Well, we were walking with the dog along the lake, Annika and I, and suddenly Hector pounced on a leather box, and inside was a photograph of the old lady that Annika used to read to before she died. The Egghart's great-aunt. Annika had seen it before, and she knew it was from the trunk. And she was very upset because she had told Lommery that the trunk hadn't gone to Spittal. And I think it upset her altogether, remembering, because she was really fond of the great-aunt. La Raudace, she called her. It means a swallow, and yes." Everyone round the kitchen table was nodded. "She talked about her a lot. She thought she could stop her dying," said Sigrid. "Go on with your story," said Professor Julius. "Well, we all thought it must mean that the trunk had arrived at Spittal after all, and someone had thrown it into the lake. But it didn't make sense. I asked Annika to tell me what had been in it. It doesn't seem to have been anything that mattered, except to the old lady, and to Annika, because she'd loved her. But I'd been uneasy about everything, really. And I told Annika not to say anything to her mother. I would see what I could find out. It was no good telling Annika not to tell things to her mother. She worships her," said Zed, and heard Ellie give an enormous sigh. "She did tell her, and the next thing was that Frau Eldrat and her brother-in-law came down late at night and said they'd made inquiries, and the people at the station had sworn that I'd collected the trunk. They were going to call the police and have me arrested." Zed looked up at the people gathered around the table. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but I swear by Rocco's head that I'm telling the truth. And I was frightened, because I knew Frau Eldrat hated me. She thought her father had spoiled me. She was only waiting for a chance to get rid of me. So I decided to go and find my mother's people in Hungary. They're gypsies, and I knew they'd take me in. But I'm frightened for Annika too. She ought not to be the woman who tells lies, and worse." "Worse?" "Yes. I think Frau Eldrat stole the trunk, with the help of her brother-in-law." "No? No, that doesn't make sense," said Professor Julius. "Why should a woman in her position steal an old trunk full of worthless things? The lawyers were absolutely certain that there was nothing of value there." "Yes," said Zed. "That's what puzzled me. So on the way to the south, I stopped at Bad Hexenwald to see the Baron von Kleppel, Frau Eldrad's uncle. He didn't really want to talk to me, but in the end he did, and then I understood." Zed had paused, was staring into space, remembering. It had been a raw, cold night when he fled from Spittal. He'd been shivering as he rode Rocco into the stable yard of the Hotel Majestic.